said interest rates would be low for a very long time. After saying that, we saw 40-year highs in inflation. We saw the most aggressive interest rate hikes seen in Canadian history. In a BNN Bloomberg interview during that time, you had talked about how much there was unprecedented government spending that happened, and you predicted much of what we're seeing today with the high interest rates at being at to 5%. You used a term that you said that it was a government engineered, and it would get to this point. Can you expand a little bit on what happened? Because I think a lot of mortgage holders today that are renewing at double or triple the rate, or the ones that can't afford their mortgage today, want to know what happened.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. I did say that at that very time. This wasn't Monday morning quarterbacking 4 years later when they drove the rates down to 1/4 point, and government, the finance minister and the prime minister were saying, borrow, they're going to stay at these levels. I instantly realized that they had made a mistake, because let me explain why. Rates, I went and did my research. Rates had never, ever in the history of Canada or the United States gone down to 1/4 point. I went all the way back to the U.S. Civil War, and they never went down to 1/4 point. And in Canada, in the Great Depression, which was 10 years, much longer than the pandemic, and 1/3 of the population out of work, and it didn't go down to 1/4. My point being that they were so low, it was inevitable that the rates were going to go up. It was not possible by any rational analysis of the historical record of interest rates that they would remain at basically zero. And so I was very critical of that, and I lived through the 70s when rates went to 20% to deal with the inflation of the then government of the time that hit 14%.
Thank you. You talked about productivity. We see in Canada here, GDP per person is declining for 6 straight quarters. GDP per capita is the lowest in growth in the entire OECD. The Bank of Canada's senior deputy governor, Carolyn Rogers, has said that this is a break glass emergency situation. Can you explain how did productivity get so bad in Canada, and why is it lower today than it was in 2018? And what the impact of some of the economic uncertainty and higher taxes have on that productivity?
Thank you again, Mr. Lawrence. I've been talking about this in my classes for literally 35 years. I've been studying and read, I think, every major document in our country on this topic, going all the way back to the 70s and the 80s. I've come to the conclusion, I agree with the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. I think that the lack of reduced competition, because we have so many protected industries, is a major contributor. I'm not suggesting it's the only contributor, but this is straight out of Schumpeter again. If you're not forced to compete, then you're not going to compete. You're not going to innovate. Why would you innovate if you don't have to innovate? And so we have created protection, a lot of protection in multiple industries, which is allowing these industries not to innovate. And to your second question, again, the research on this is very, very clear. Displacing and crowding out the private markets with government spending that's classified as investment is not going to, at least in any of the evidence I have seen, is not going to increase productivity. We have a crisis in this country, and it's not just the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. David Dodge has talked about this. John Manley, the former Liberal, has talked about this. Bill Morneau has talked about it. So this is not a quote, conservative view. It's the numbers are shouting at us that we have a profound problem that's going to hurt our young people.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I have, I think, enough time for one more question. I wanted to talk about something that you brought up in another BNN Bloomberg interview when you said during the pandemic how untargeted universal government programs are squandering Canada's resources. We know Canadians are in a cost of living crisis right now. This government is constantly creating big government programs. A lot of the government's existing and announced programs don't increase productivity or make Canada more expensive or create jobs. What effect do you think these large programs have on affordability and productivity in Canada?
Thank you again. I have been very critical of them, and not because I was opposed to helping people that need help. Of course we do. That is the Canadian way. We've been doing this my entire life. As my late mother, who grew up in the Depression in Saskatchewan, reminded me, there was no public health care. There was no old age pension in the 30s. There was none of the programs we have now. This is not about dismantling the social programs for our people that need help. But universality, which is giving money to high-income people and upper-middle-class people like professors, is just simply wrong. It is just wrong to say I should be getting free medicine from the taxpayer when I have a private insurance plan. We should be targeting it to people who need help at the bottom, not privileged people like members of parliament and professors and public servants. That's squandering scarce, desperately scarce public funds when we should be targeting it just on there and then focusing on growth to create the economy and the growth of the future that's going to generate, by the way, tax revenues to the governments to then redistribute on various consumption programs.
Marty.
Lee, so MP Howland has one final question. Oh, no, it's gone to MP Morantz. Yeah.
1 minute? Okay.
One question.
Professor, in my 1 minute, I want to ask you if you agree with the following statement, a quote from Milton Friedman. A society that puts equality ahead of freedom will end up with neither. A society that puts freedom ahead of equality will end up with a high degree of both. Do you agree with that, and do you think it applies to Canada today?
I do. I certainly studied Milton Friedman when I started my master's and my PhD. I went back as a mature student at the age of 30. I'm a high school dropout, by the way. I was really stupid and irresponsible when I was a teenager. So I learned my lesson. I realized education is the key, and I studied Milton Friedman. I also studied a lot of the thinkers that were in that period of the 80s, the economic deregulation reference of the Economic Council, because this was all very fertile times. But yes, there is, and I've taught in former communist countries, former centrally planned economies, and I don't believe you can have one without the other. They are joined at the hip.
The dental care program today doesn't have a lot of dentists signed up for it. Do you think it would have been more advantageous to use the existing provincial programs that were already had dentists signed up across the country to deliver the same benefit?
I think, at least anecdotally, from having worked in Ontario and now in Saskatchewan, if it was a carbon copy of the provincial plans, you may actually have less dentists wanting to be involved. There's just a historic distrust between provincial plans and the dental profession because they've only ever been clawed back and have. So that's where the kind of issue with administrative burden comes from, is having to deal with a lot of these provincial plans.
Okay.
So I think there's some optimism for the federal.
Would it surprise you to learn that $1 billion of the spend is going to administration?
Heard that, but I
$750 million is going to Sun Life, and almost $200 million is going to Health Canada.
Knowing, again, in my public health work, I've done evaluation of a lot of plans, and so I know that's a realistic cost in terms of development because of the upfront infrastructure that has to be in place, particularly on the timeline to get this out there.
Okay. We've heard testimony, and it's been reported in the news, that some employers are trying to carve out those that will become eligible for the plan. Do you think that's a concern?
I do. In our current system, I do think it is, because at least the projections for those who will enroll is based on the idea that there are many with private coverage within those income ranges.
Right.
And so I don't know if there is the capacity at this time, should private plans or employment-based insurance start to disappear. And I think that was one of the earlier points made when it was first launched in some of the groups that,
uploading of costs. There's also some provinces who are advocating the role now. If you had a patient, or if you hypothetically were advising a patient who had a private plan, who called you and said, there's a new federal plan, should I leave my current private coverage and join the public plan? What would you advise them to do?
I would probably tell them to continue on as they are with that, because they're more familiar with what they have. And again, it's, there are some private plans that actually cover less as a percentage than some of the public plans, but at the same time, it's still very new in terms of what's covered, what's not. So they have their existing plan, their services that they're comfortable with to keep that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MP Chambers. Now to MP Baker for about 2-3 minutes.
I'm old enough to remember the 1980s. So in the 1980s, we saw the birth of what was called neoliberal economics. We saw the introduction of that I think has continued to this day. We've had lower corporate taxes. We pursued liberalized trade, signing trade agreements, removing most tariffs. We had pursued deregulation in everything from the airlines, where we sold off Air Canada and deregulated the airlines. We sold off Petro-Canada. We have fewer regulations today, certainly, than we did in the 1980s. Yet spending on machinery and equipment by businesses and on R&D and innovation in Canada has been falling as a share of GDP, dating right back to the beginning of the century. Can you explain that to me?
I think I can. Forgive my arrogance. Again, I've read a ton on this, and I've come to the conclusion, I think Deputy Governor Rogers has too, I think David Dodge has, and many others, but I've come to the conclusion it's because we have too many protected industries. We don't even have free trade in Canada between the provinces. The IMF estimates that if we had genuine free trade between BC, Ontario, etc., it would be the equivalent of a 22% tariff reduction. I mean, that's massive. Massive in terms of the impact on GDP. So we've met the enemy, and it's us. We've done it to ourselves. Our banking is protected. Our airlines are protected. The fees are twice as large. I mean, dairy is protected, as we all know, through supply management. We have many protected industries, and I'm as cynical about business as any progressive, and I'm not a progressive. I'm a fiscal conservative. I don't hide it. But corporations...
we noted that.
They don't have to. Yes. Corporations will not compete if they don't have to. We've got to make them compete. Make them compete. Open it up. Remove all protection for these companies.
I wanted to come back to Mr. Lee, if I could, just on the topic of competition. I'm of the view that we talked a lot about competition here at this committee, and in particular, and you mentioned it, my view is we don't have enough competition in a few sectors in this country. Airlines comes to mind, telecommunications comes to mind, banking comes to mind. I think you mentioned one or two of those in an earlier response. So what will we have to do to meaningfully increase competition in those three sectors?
Thank you. Please believe me, thank you. We have to remove the legislative protections that protect those firms against external competition. And I know there are people who say, oh my goodness, I'm unionized, by the way, at the university. And I hear union colleagues saying, oh my goodness, if they come in, we're going to create massive unemployment. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I lived through Balcerowicz when he did the cold shock therapy of 1993-95. And Poland was destitute, poverty, bankrupt, and in 24 months, they went through a deep recession for sure. And then Poland took off, and there's no other country the IMF has ruled, as evaluated, that has been as successful in the post-communist era as Poland. And they adopted all these pro-market reforms that we're talking about. So we've got to open it up. I don't believe that there'll be mass unemployment. The new entrants will employ those Canadians that are laid off by Bell or by Rogers. That's great. Or the other industries that are opened up. So it's going to create growth and create productivity. It's not going to create unemployment. If we open them up and remove those legislative prohibitions against foreign firms coming in. Let Verizon come into Canada.
So can I ask you specifically about airlines? Because the example that's been raised by people is we should allow, like all of these sectors we've just talked about have significant barriers to entry. Yes, but I want to focus on airlines. Is that mean, are you recommending open skies in Canada? Like United Airlines, American Airlines, et cetera, should come in and be able to fly point to point in Canada? So Toronto, Vancouver,
Yes.
Toronto, Montreal, whatever the case may be, whatever routes they so choose?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I've been challenged by this and said, we'll lose our Canadian identity. I've flown on Lufthansa, and I've never learned how to speak German. I've flown on Aeroflot, and I've never learned to speak Russian. I have not been assimilated by flying on other airlines just because it has a foreign flag on it. We will not lose our Canadian identity just because I just flew. I'm in Hilton Head.